Here we are.
Here we are live on Facebook and YouTube. How are you doing,
Wonderful.
Oak?
Feeling great, brother. Grateful to be here with you. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss and see what we discover.
Yeah, me too. I want to give a shout out to Jay because he is a very close friend. I know of you as well. And
Yeah,
when he was on my live stream 1 week ago, he was like, "You got to talk to Oak." And I was like, "Oh, I want to talk to Oak. This is actually the plan anyway." So this
oh,
is literally perfect.
big shout out to you, Jay. Love you, buddy. Miss you.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we really get started here, because I noticed that it takes 2 or 3 minutes for people to really hop on. Can you just give a little description about who you are and where you live and what your general MO is?
Sure. Well, my name's Oak. I'm born and raised in Calgary, Alberta. I've lived all throughout the world, including in Melbourne, Australia, Mexico, currently located in Puerto Vallarta. I am an author, a philosopher with an academic history in philosophy and the study of religion, and currently bringing my offerings focused around conscious and connective communication to the world.
Beautiful. Can I ask what inspired that? What brought you to want to talk about something that I think is so important? So I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm just curious.
totally. It's twofold, I would say. On the one hand, on the more personal side, I had my 29th birthday in July, and I took inventory of my life, and I went, okay, am I satisfied with the life I've lived so far and the legacy that this would produce if I were to continue on this path? And the answer was a very stark and resounding no. And so I sat with myself for quite some time and went through a few medicine ceremonies and some soul searching, and was gifted a clear vision of what I can offer into this world and how I might offer that. And so why the other limb, why I've chosen communication, is because it's pervasive. Language is pervasive. Speech is pervasive. And it is something that is nearly inescapable in our daily life in this modern world, from social media to the conventional media, text messages, voice messages, the conversations that we're having between people, the conversations we have with ourselves. And it seems like we're awash, we're almost floating in a sea of language, and having an interest and a proclivity for language and linguistics and the rhetoric and logic of speech, and a real driving love of truth. I felt that my own learnings when it comes to speech and language and truthfulness and connection therein would be broadly valuable, as I've seen it transform my life and transform the lives of others, that being the capacity to speak truthfully and connect through communication. So I thought, let's bring the two together and offer forth.
Beautiful. And one of the things about being truthful is having to know in oneself what is true as well, right? So it's interesting because that process, you could learn about how to communicate, but what you're driving people towards is how to know themselves. And I think that is like the most important part of the whole thing, is that once a person goes, okay, I need to communicate better. So imagine you're doing it from a surface level. I'm going to have to communicate better. I'll use this tip and I'll use this tip. But then the truth is, what do you really feel? Like, what do you really feel? Like, what is underneath it all? Where in your body do you feel it? When people really get into that understanding, then that's transformational just in itself. Like, just that one thing of figuring out who I am and how I feel and how to communicate that would be a lifetime of learning essentially for a lot of people. So I
Truly.
really value that as a pathway to self-understanding as well. And I can definitely see, again, reading the table of contents from your book has been amazing, and reading that little foreword where explained the teachings of Lao Tzu, and the teaching specifically that we can't understand the world with our mind and with our language. And yet again, it's a trick, because then by understanding language, we actually can get into those deeper aspects of self as well.
100%. It's like the reciprocal to the offering forth of our speech is the willingness to listen, both to our inner world and to the world as a whole. And so, as you're speaking about, it's a path of inner knowing. The capacity that we have to offer value increases the more familiar we are with the subject matter at hand. And so when we're speaking about conversations, particularly between people, maybe lovers, family, friends, the deeper you're in communion with your own truth, your own senses, your own perceptive and sensible nature, so to say, the more there is for you to speak about, and the more precise you can be about those things. And you end up, as I would argue and do argue in the book, that you are offering greater value by having a closer communion with the truth that's in your own heart.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, I'm going to go through this basically and just bring up certain things. If you can basically just wrap on each of the subjects. I really love the difference between a prescription versus a description in language. That's something that I also talk about quite a bit. Can you describe what that means? Every now and then, by the way, Oak, I'm going to do this, so you're going to be by yourself, but I'm still here.
Great. No worries. Yeah, so the prescriptivist versus descriptivist, these are two different avenues of looking at language as a whole. So the prescriptivists are more keen to look at the structure present in language, looking at rules, grammar, syntax, where do words fall in a sentence, how do they engage with the, say, verb, noun order, the conjugation, when are particular tenses relevant, things like this, and very more geared towards the regulatory side. What is the correct way of speaking based on the rules of language? Whereas a descriptivist would look at how language is used and then present an opinion or an evaluation from that perspective. And it's very clear that if we're taking a descriptivist point of view, that it's not common that perfect language is used more often than not. And so there's this interesting interplay, at least in my mind, where I like, for my own speech, I try to, when I'm articulating, when I'm writing, when I'm having conversations with open-hearted people like yourself, to lean towards that prescriptivist. What exactly am I trying to say? How can I be the most precise in this? And how can I offer forth the most accurate understanding of what it is that I mean to this other person using the structure of language? But that can ossify. We can become too rigid, and sometimes, and like you mentioned with the foreword in the teachings of Lao Tzu, there is an upper limit or a lower limit, so to say, of the capacity that language has to accurately depict truth or the nature or the Tao, whatever it is that we're trying to drive at. And sometimes the closest we can get is a sound, or a portmanteau, or some sort of amalgamation or sort of twisting and contorting of language and sound, infused with emotion and other types of expressive mediums, say body language or facial expression and things like this, to convey the meaning beyond the sound itself or the word itself.
Right. So you're saying that there is truth that almost can't be captured by words, like it's not. And just to go into that a little bit further, because you mentioned it's the fork trying to pick up the ocean with water, right? It's like, to describe that to the audience. When we are, just one second here. Yeah. Sasha is in here right now, who is a linguist and works very, very strongly. He just came in to say, hi, Josh. It's fascinating. One of the things that they say is, like, I'm trying to think of a cool way to describe it. Like, if you're inside of something, you can't describe the boundaries of that thing. So we're inside this world. So our attempts to describe the world are within the world. All of our attempts at description are within the actual world itself. And trying to describe anything outside of that world is impossible. It's a very strange thing. So if we're inside our own mind, we can only use the words that work in our mind to try and describe our mind, but that means that by nature we're missing something. We're going to miss something that's broader. It's a very strange subject to try to even talk about, because language doesn't actually suit. But it was one of the big teachings through Alan Watts that really helped me open up my mind, because again, I did live in a world where I used to have a thing where if someone talked to me, I would repeat back what they had said to myself in my own mind. Or if I was reading, I would read the word, then I would repeat it back in my own mind. And when that echo stopped, that was actually when my mind started to truly open. Like, in other words, the echo of my own mind echoing whatever I was seeing, reading, listening to, whatever it was, that read description, like redescribing what I was already reading. And when there was a beautiful, I think it was just The Power of Now, even like Alan Watts and The Power of Now, a combination of both of those things. I remember that he just said, stop doing that. Like, just be silent in
Stop.
yourself while you read. And I remember being like, holy fuck, Jesus, like that cleared, I'd say 80% of my own mental confusion just by reading without then trying to analyze or without then echoing what was read. So I think that there's some similarity in what you're describing with Lao Tzu's work. In not having to be constrained within a matrix to try and describe what's in that matrix, but actually popping it all open. I'm sorry, I'm not particularly clear in my speech right now, but I think you understand what I'm getting at.
Sure, absolutely. I think there's a couple very relevant points that might be worth investigating from what you've shared. The first being the latter of what you've spoken, that this communion is bi-directional. So wherein we're listening and we're receiving information and we're taking it in, we're also offering it forth through the mind, through thought. And it's not necessarily that all thought is shared forth with the listener, whoever we're speaking with, so to say, but it is necessarily an eminent phenomenon. When our mind is active, thinking, especially when it comes to language in the frontal cortex, it is operating within that beta wave frequency. It's operating at a higher frequency and it's emanating at a higher resonance. And so that can be, like you're saying, disruptive in a sense. It's almost creating an element of dissonance. If we think about the alpha wave state, the states that are associated with the greatest levels of receptivity, they're low linguistic, low mentality. It's open to flow and creativity and inspiration and intuition. And that's because that bidirectional channel, it's one channel, right? That's moving in both directions. It's like that microcosmic orbit is clear. But we end up clogging it when we repetitiously and perhaps needlessly echo our own thoughts inside of it. If we think, here's how maybe how I picture it sometimes, is like almost like the reverse of a pyramid. At the very base of this pyramid is my soul's vibration, my spirit's vibration, all the way down to the core of my being. And we emanate out in levels of complexity. And so when I'm receiving something, the more agitation or activity there is at those more complex levels, the less likely it will be to get down to the center. Somewhere in the middle is the heart space, right? And if I'm thinking, my heart can't really hear. Because the nervous system is occupied with the contents of that prefrontal cortex. But we can turn that listening. This is the skill, right? And this is easier said than done. Here we are speaking about language and talking. Easier said than done is a nice turn of phrase. But talking about that self-knowledge and talking about that listening, it's like, okay, what does it mean to listen to the body? What does it mean to listen to the body while someone is speaking? What does it mean to listen to the body's response while someone is speaking? And there's all these different levels that can be articulated, that can be sensed, that can be heard and felt, that in my experience go missed or covered or obscured when there is maybe a propensity or a need to be mentally occupied with a response.
Absolutely. And that's, I did a course with a teacher of mine, and he had us sit across from a person for 5 minutes at a time while the other person spoke. And we had to train out, even, of course, it's beautiful to do in normal conversation, but even training out nodding, training out affirming, training out, oftentimes people more struggle with criticizing when people talk, but even in the affirmation, that can still create more fettering, right? Like, it's like, I think what you're trying to describe is that when we are silent in mind, then we're going to receive things clearly. The more complicated the thought forms are over top of that clear space inside, the more we're not actually being able to hear the people that and what they're saying, right? I mean, it's like there's a million ways to say that same thing because it is so fundamentally simple. But at the same time, it is the actual complexity of trying to use language at all that keeps us from that thing. So it's a really funny, it's a funny trick, isn't it?
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
about not needing to talk, to talk about silence is like it's a funny thing, but it's necessary. I do think it's important that, because if not, we would just sit completely silently. There'd be nothing to communicate.
Well, this conversation about the boundaries of potential and usefulness is almost a mirroring. We can find a mirroring within the scientific disciplines as well. It's like we have to define our parameters in order to explore the space. And so we can sit here and at the start of this conversation and go, we necessarily are going to fail at hitting the mark perfectly when it comes to the truth about language and connection. And yet we will try our best. And along the way, hopefully make some discoveries that will, if applied and maybe contemplated on with earnestness, lead us closer to the other side of that boundary.
It's interesting. A part of what in the course that I'm trying to develop right now is about accepting that we're going to fuck it up, because in trying to be perfect, we create a new layer of dissonance that will actually keep us from the actual interplay that's necessary to get to where we're going. And so it's a funny thing, because if I think that there's something very powerful in just saying that, like, look, I know my own issues, and those issues are likely going to keep on manifesting or keep on coming up. And being okay with that, ironically, then lessens those issues from coming up. It's a strange it's a strange loop, all these Zen tricks.
Well, Alan Watts talks about this, right? It's like in wanting a positive experience, it's wanting a positive experience when there isn't one is a bad one, and accepting a negative experience ends up being a good one.
Yeah, exactly. It's
okay. Well,
super.
Thank you.
It's super interesting. Sasha has just been here. Thank you very much for being here with us, man. Just saying, all these ideas are fascinating. They absolutely are. Going into identifying dissonance, just because when you mentioned that before, I've got your thing up here, and it's amazing. The dissonance of the mind and emotions is what we were just talking about, right? That at the core of our silence, without mind, without emotions, we can transmit very clearly. But when there is a lot of mental activity or a lot of emotional activity, the less clear that transmission becomes. Is that a fair thing to say?
That's definitely an element of it, for sure. The dissonance, identifying dissonance, there's multiple levels of it. So in the one piece that you just mentioned, this strive for perfection is one form of dissonance, wherein our, we'll say, genuine capacity to make manifest an outcome and our expected or desired outcome are incongruent. And so what comes forth through our lives through action will necessarily not be congruent, and therefore create a level of dissonance in ourselves, because we will be without that which we desire. And so that's one element. And that's very a Buddhist thing, right? The more you desire something, the more you're going to suffer for it. Another aspect of the dissonance, particularly of mind and emotions, has to do with narrative, story, and say self-authorship or self-talk. So we have the idea and the propensity to go towards perfection. And then there might be something like, if I don't achieve this, I am not good enough, or I'm going to be a failure, or I'm this and I'm that, and I'm all of these things. And so there's a dissonance internally, because we don't want to be, one, perceiving ourselves as anything less than worthy and lovable and good, so to say, at the very base. And yet the stories that we write based on the dissonance between our expected outcomes or desired outcomes and the genuine outcomes then produces this internal dissonance as well. And so very the narratives, right? It's the narrative structure that we set up that comes with it, what brings with it rather, expectation, projected expectation, in the form of language, in the form of thought, in the form of story that gets carried like a little backpack, that will be I almost picture it like the rough edges that allow for roots to grab onto or for algae to grow. It's like it creates a textured surface that necessarily will beget further forms of dissonance, because at its core, it is not at harmony. We're not at harmony when we are expectant. And in terms of emotions, I mean, I can pass. Yeah,
I see here the dissonance of intention, which is a very, I'd say that's what you're touching on right now. It's like we might have a really beautiful intention, but that might, it's good to have good intentions, but we might end up not seeing clearly as we're moving forward, if that's the case. Is that fair to say?
Definitely, that's an element of it. Particularly in that section of the book, Dissonance of Intention speaks about deception, things like gaslighting, things like lying, things like the intentional manipulation, and where the dissonance exists both in terms of what is said and reality, and also what is perceived to be the intention of the speaker and what is believed to be the intention, or sorry, what is the actual intention versus the believed intention of the speaker. So, people with psychopathic personality disorder or sociopathic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder will use language in such a way that their intention has nothing to do with what is spoken. It's the ulterior motive, so to say. I've got something else that is driving my behavior, driving my language, structuring my language so that I will elicit not only an emotional response in you, but also a physical outcome. Maybe you'll pay me, maybe you'll go on a date with me, maybe you'll lend me your car. Who knows what these people do? But
that's not what they're truly feeling on the inside. The outward expression is not in alignment with the actual intentions and behind.
And directly obfuscating in a lot of cases, and the damage that can cause, that dissonance.
Sasha had a question. It says, do definitions play a role in understanding within Eastern traditions? In other words, are the definitions that people use, did they focus on that the same way that we do in the Western world?
It definitely depends on the tradition. Excellent question. Thank you, Sasha. The first thing that jumps to mind is a Buddhist concept called upaya. And that's roughly translates to skill in means. And so essentially, to be skillful in upaya is to be able to deliver the Dharma to someone at their level of understanding. So if we're speaking, we pretend, maybe I'm the student and there's a master, and the master is speaking to me, realizing that I'm very much still within this framework of language and the framework of mentality and thought. They will rely on the relevance of definitions in order to provide the most value, get the Dharma closest to that Buddha in my center, so to say. Ultimately, when we go to the deepest of the mystical traditions within Buddhism, within Hinduism, even within the Western Abrahamic traditions, language falls apart. We hit that upper limit like we were talking about, and it's right at that edge where language no longer becomes a structure or a task doer, so to say. It's not like it is describing something or providing information. It then becomes a transformative tool. And in the ninth chapter of the book, Transformative Powers of Language, I speak about the power of the koan, particularly in Zen Buddhism, and how that is an example where, although these words have definitions within the koan, the definitions are completely beside the point. The task of the koan, at least in the words of Stephen T. Katz, who's the American philosopher that I wrote on in university, and I also reference in the book, it's no longer to explain or define or provide information, but it is explicitly to transform consciousness.
And those are words that are used temporarily as well, and if they're used correctly, will dissolve themselves. That's the way that I would look at that anyway. And there's everyone knows this teaching, but there's a teaching where if a teaching is a raft, you're using it to get across the water. After you get across the water, you don't want to pick up the raft and keep on walking, right? You want to leave the raft behind. And I think that that's a very perfect way to use that analogy, is that we use language in this case in order to get to where people are at, and then with the hopes that through that transmission, the actual language will dissipate into essentially silence, which is where, again, you could say our souls tend to rest. With identifying dissonance, we've just gone through. Let's go back to the resonant universe, because we've just talked about the dissonant part. What about the resonant part? So when we get into what feels like resonance with universal flow or with other people, can you describe that process?
Sure. As it relates to language, the old adage, or the most common thing we hear nowadays within the New Age circles, is that everything is vibration. Levels of physics tell us this. And we can see through sympathetic resonance that this is the case in the molecular level as well as the biological level. And so understanding, like we spoke about earlier with the alpha waves and the beta waves, in the neurology, the neurophysiology, that resonance and the laws of fundamental harmony apply to all levels of our experience. And recognizing that that is the case, we can then turn that understanding onto language itself and go, what is the resonant quality of my language? What is the resonant quality of my body that is the carrier or the beacon of this language? Am I speaking in ways that harmonize my internal world and the external world? Am I cutting people down? Am I cutting myself down? And understanding that at the very fundamental level, all things are harmonically intertwined, are acting in this vibratory and harmonic state, allows us to, at least it's my hope with the book anyways, to get a greater picture of where the power of speech and language comes from.
Mm-hmm. And so is it coming from a place, again, that is beneficial and that is aligned with the universal flow or not? You know, is that a fair...
Yeah, it's a tricky one when we get to harmony and dissonance, because it's not quite as simple as a binary to say, is it in alignment or in harmony?
It's either good or
not,
bad. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Because dissonance has its role. We need stress in the world. Like, I don't know what kind of music you listen to. I particularly enjoy jazz and some types of metal, as well as, folk and all sorts of other things.
Sure.
But tension is created by dissonance. The incoherence, so to say, between two notes or two frequencies is actually a very pregnant and potentialized space for movement. And so if you go around all the time as a dissonant being, never capitalizing on the opportunity that dissonance presents for your own evolution and for the evolution of others, again, we miss the point. But when we encounter those elements of dissonance in ourselves, dissonance in our language, it's an opportunity for refinement and for greater harmony.
I love that, man. That is fucking cool teaching right there. In other words, like as well, you know, being critical, for example, can be super important. It's really important not to just take everything at face value and never send a criticism. But if we're only criticizing to the point where we're not able to actually make any headway, then you'll live a miserable life, right? Like that would be that makes a lot of sense. I believe this must be one of your friends. Bianca Leclerc just came in and said, amazing. I love that.
Bianca.
Yeah. Beautiful. Let me see what else we are doing here. The qualities of sovereign speech was something that really struck out to me when I was reading it through as well. Would you go into some of those qualities?
Yeah, my brother. That's the heart of the book. I crafted all the other pieces to be supportive of that. You could take that chapter itself out if you were only to read one. I think that would be the one to read. And
beautiful.
And as for those, I did my best to distill them down as best I could. And so as far as I understand it, the qualities of sovereign speech are truthful, compassionate, and precise. And I make an argument for the viability and the necessity of each of those. And we can talk about any of the three or all three as you see fit.
All three would be great.
Great. Sure. So in terms of truthfulness, fundamentally, as I open the book with an inquiry into what brings meaning into speech, where is our meaning when we talk grounded? Because there has to be meaning. We're moving here, we're having a discussion, we have this experience of understanding, and we move through the world with the assumption that knowledge is present. Where the hell does that come from? Well, in fact, it comes from the very fabric of the universe itself. That being, this instantiated isness that is right at the very edge or pinnacle of what is capable of being described, is the meaning granting field. Because it has value, and because it has value, it is worthy of pursuit. And so we bring greater value into our speech by speaking truthfully as we can, because obviously we're ignorant. We're going to be ignorant about more things than we could ever possibly fathom. And yet the endeavor to imbue our speech and to articulate in such a way that maintains the highest degree of truthfulness ensures that not only are we offering the greatest value into the world, but we're bringing forth the greatest harmony that we are able to do. Because that which is truthful, genuinely truthful, is harmonious, fundamentally.
Even if you're expressing something negative, or something that's true but painful. As long as it's actually true, it ends up being helpful or resonant.
Yeah. What is wrong with pain is a question in this, like we talked about dissonance. If someone says something to me that is upsetting to me, but true, I prefer this. I would rather you speak the truth to me and it be painful than to lie to me and me to live in this falsified world, because the dissonance of pain is the opportunity for refinement, but it's also ignorance leaving. It's only painful because I was ignorant. It's only painful because I was wrong. Well, thank God. If I'm never wrong, well, God, if I go a day without figuring out that I'm wrong, something is not right. It's not good. Not good. You have to, yeah, please continue.
And this does lead into compassionate speech as well. So the question is, again, how does, I would love to know with your theology and how this is working, how do you say something that could be potentially harmful to somebody in a compassionate way while knowing that it needs to be done?
Yeah. I mean, welcome to the greatest lesson of my life, I so say. It's not easy, and it's an interesting interplay that you bring up, because painful, harmful, like, what is the nature of harm? I explore this a little bit. Is harm to be avoided in all cases, or is the value that we bring forth through truthful speech more valuable than avoiding certain harms? And that's an evaluation. Well, that's an evaluation that you have to make as an agent, as an individual person who has volitional control over their actions. That's up to you to decide, and you're the one who's going to bear the consequences of that, right? Within Ashtanga Yoga, as an example, the 8 limbs of yoga, the first 2 of the yamas and the niyamas. Within the first, we have satya, which is truthfulness, and ahimsa, which is nonviolence. And the concept, and this is brought forth to me by a dear friend, Ashley Rogers. She's currently studying in India at a Ashtanga Yoga ashram. Wonderful. She distills this to me, and she repeats this to me all the time. Ahimsa tempers satya. So nonviolence tempers truthfulness. You can't go around waving your sword of truthfulness at everybody and chopping everyone's heads off. I mean, you can, but you will inevitably be generating dissonance that you will not be capable of harmonizing if you are not skillful in its application. If you're
I
not
would say
delicate in its
there
application.
are quite a few people in that situation right now with social media and with activism the way it is. And I would say that it's actually probably what you're describing is kind of the collective lesson of our time, is how do we help people transform into something really important, let's say, like environmentalism or all of the craziness that just happened over the last few years. How do you bring that stuff up without ostracizing other people or claiming superiority in knowledge, while at the same time knowing that there is things that need to be talked about? I would love to know personally how you feel about that.
I would approach it from 2 vantage points. The first being, never compromise speaking what is true for you and about you, regardless of how other people feel about it.
Because that's centered in self. That's saying this is what I feel, this is what I've experienced, that keeping it to relative to one's life.
Sure, 100%. And that's different than beliefs. I'm speaking more so about values, right? If someone says, oh, you think this, don't you? And you don't agree. Don't agree to anything that you believe to be contrary to your own values. It's not a great idea. It will erode the foundation of your integrity and strength, and will necessarily weaken yourself and the relationships you participate in. So that's one vantage point. The second vantage point, I would say, is to very simply ask for permission. And now this is
consent,
not permission.
consent. Yeah.
And it's not permission to speak. It's permission to address a topic. So let's say that you and I are out at coffee, and I recognize something about a habit of yours, maybe speaking or a way that you're interacting with someone that isn't me. And I feel like, based on my understanding of your values through our friendship, that it would be valuable for you to become aware of this, and you aren't. Well, okay. So it's in alignment with my virtue and my values to offer forth this truth, because I believe, based on my own standards that may not be shared by you, that it's valuable. And
Mm-hmm.
yet that which is to be spoken of lies within the realm of your mind, your soul, your spirit. And so I can say to you, Josh, there's something I would like to bring up to you as it pertains to your interactions with so-and-so.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel capable of receiving a reflection in this moment?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Oop. We lost my video feed here.
I noticed that as well, but I can hear your audio quite well. So
Okay. Oh, there we
there
go.
you are. Yeah.
Great.
No,
So,
but that's fantastic. And again, that's not the same as if you and I were having the interaction. You could say, hey, Josh, that actually was really hurtful when you said this, or it'd be a lot easier for me if you weren't doing this to me, or you weren't saying that to me. That's different than seeing it in somebody else. That's when we need to have consent, because it's like, oh, actually, I really think that Josh could use this info, but that's different than you've personally affected me. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, and consent. It's same with if you have something big that you're trying to vent. It's really important to say to somebody, do you have the time and space for me to vent this right now? That consent in both of those scenarios, I think, is like really, really important. I mean, if not, we could border on violating somebody else and unintentionally as well.
100%. And if we stick with the concept of sovereignty, as this is the piece we're speaking to, sovereign speech, you imagine yourself a king. All that lies within your kingdom is within your domain to rule over, to speak to, and to change. And that is your mind, your emotions, your actions, your body. And so when I come to you as a sovereign individual, I don't get to make any claims or statements about how you ought to run your kingdom. And that's where that boundary lies. And it's a recognition of sovereignty to ask for consent, to check in. It's to say that which governs the highest quality of your being, I recognize and speak to. At least that's how I do it.
I love that, man. Just wanted to put some comments up here. Sasha just said, I like Oak's link between truth, meaning, and value. It's something that I talked to. Sasha and I are quite close, and he speaks about truth, meaning, and value quite a bit. So I think that the way you move those together was really important. And my friend Delisha came up to just say, congrats on your book. I just like to make sure that people's voices are heard through the comments,
100%.
As it encourages more dialogue and more bounce.
Yeah, may I speak to Sasha's comment? There's actually something that might be quite interesting to bring up there. The link between those is etymological at its root. So when we look at value, the root of value being valere, meaning strong, dependable, something that can withstand, steadfast. And with truth, we also see this root of strong. And so it's really interesting to peer into that and go, okay, why is it that value comes from strength and valor, and we have truth also coming from deru, from that same similar root? And so as I was peeling down through that, I realized that it comes to trust. And this was an interesting piece that when we're talking about relationships and these other elements of consent, is that trust relies on truth, because trust is the voluntary acceptance of our vulnerability. We put over our vulnerability into somebody else's hands when we enter into a trusting relationship with them. And that which is worthy of trust endures. So what is exactly is enduring? The intention and the manifest action. There's an endurance in their not synchronicity, but harmony, so to say. It's like if you tell me you're going to do something and it comes to be, it's trustworthy, it's valuable, it's dependable in that sense. So that's just a little side note.
I'd say something on that same topic is that I do really believe in the power of clear contracts, which means, for example, if I definitely do not intend to do something, I think it's really important to say that as well, or to not at least agree to something, knowing that that's not what I actually feel to do. That's something I feel really, really passionate about, hey, because I've gotten myself through, of course, I'm passionate because I fucked it up so many times in relation to ensuring that I don't over oblige. Like, it has to be that everything has been very well and carefully crafted in consent, and when that is the case, I have to fulfill it, or at least describe very clearly why I've decided to back out of that contract. But that just the importance of clear contracts, I do believe, is one of the more important things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Sasha just said thank you for describing all of that as well.
Yeah,
Again, I really appreciate the comments and the interaction, Sasha.
The last
So
is
coming,
precise.
yeah, and so because again, this is what I'm focused on right now. In chapter 9, we have the transformative power of language, and we have liberation, the prison of our own making, forgiveness, transformation, language as a sound and as a vehicle, language and sound as a vehicle, sorry, affirmations and neurolinguistic programming and collective evolution. I would love if you have the time to kind of go through those points that are coming up in your book, man. Those are very important points.
Sure. As we've sort of touched on in a few different avenues, language is one of the structures by which we not only interact with the world from an external point of view, but also how we take in the world. It's an interpretive framework that exists inside our minds and exists inside the collective. And so the capacity for transformation lies within the very power that language has to structure understanding. And when we are able to address the structures themselves, recognize those pieces that are introducing dissonance, that is where we find those opportunities, those nexus to say, here, there's an underlying falsehood. And if I can transform, if I can bring this dissonance into harmony through a transformation of language, or, otherwise, there's a lot of different pieces in there, but through a transformation in language, all those subsequent structures that have relied on that one particular belief, that interpretive belief, are going to fall away. Okay, what happens when our interpretive structures fall away? We necessarily see ourselves, our relationships in the world differently, because the capacity we have to take in information and to interpret information has transformed radically. It's like we can use a small example of someone who has suffered childhood trauma and bonding trauma, abandonment trauma. For someone to have gone through years of this at a very young age, there's an interpretive framework around the worthiness of people. I can't trust people. They're going to leave me. They're going to do this, or all of these different stories that stack up that are fundamental in the interpretive framework. And when there's a powerful nexus, not just in saying, I'm going to speak differently, but coming to the element and the actual locus of that belief within the body. That's the key. Where does this live in the body? Where does the story live in the body? And introducing an antidote of language into that space, openness comes. It's like if we think of dissonance as tension, that tension is released through the harmony that can come from that acknowledgement and that recognition. It's like, I don't know if you've been through any sort of transformational festivals or medicine ceremonies and things like this. Sometimes one sentence or one idea can land at a moment of emotional intensity that is like a key. And from there, the nervous system goes, oh, that's the answer. That's the piece I missed. That's the element of understanding encoded in language that allows the nervous system to open back up to deeper receptivity, not only to itself, but also to the outside world.
Oh, I love that, man. That's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. And I would say that I've experienced that absolutely in medicine ceremony, but also even just in pretty regular interactions with certain people too. Like it is possible that in a very small interaction, boom, one of those keys might come and it's like, oh shit, that actually fundamentally changed my life. Thank you for that. And it could have been that it wasn't even meant to be as meaningful a conversation as it ended up being,
Yeah.
But I guess, again, if we have the ears to hear, then those we'll hear the whispers more, right?
Yeah. Well, 100%. That's like we talked about the unoccupied mind generating greater receptivity at deeper levels of consciousness. And so I genuinely believe that at all times, everything that is coming into our world from a visual, acoustic, and sensory point of view is harmonized to our divine plan. And our capacity to recognize it lies exclusively with our willingness to receive.
Mm-hmm.
And our level of interpretive intelligence, so to say. Not to say that some people are, not intelligent, but we all possess at different times in our lives different levels of intelligence, of interpretation. And yeah, it's a very, very powerful piece,
Oh, look, there's one more chapter I'd like to go over, and that's the
Please.
power that comes with responsibility. With power comes responsibility, which is, of course,
Mm-hmm.
what we've all heard in Spider-Man. But I would love for you to go into that a little bit more, and then I'd like to ask you a question outside of the book structure as well.
Great. Yeah.
So what does that mean? With power comes responsibility.
Well, insofar as it relates to speech and language, you as an actor, Josh, and you, Sasha, listening, and all the others who hear this, are continually transforming.
Speaking of which, I only just caught this. Is your book buyable at this point?
No, we're in the pre-sale point of this. There should be a link in the description where you can add your email, Sasha, to the list, and as soon as it goes live, you'll get an email about that.
So I'll put it into the comments here right now.
Great, wonderful. I'll continue here. So you as an actor, as a speaker, as an agent in this world, are continually emitting energy through your speech, through your heart, and through your actions. And so when we start to recognize that we are vibratory beings emanating creative energy through our language and through our hearts, we recognize that we have an unavoidable, transformative, and influential capacity on the world. And the fact that we are influential actors means that we have the responsibility for the influence that we have on the world, on ourselves and on others. And so through the elements of sovereign speech, truthful, compassionate, and precise, I believe it's our responsibility to, as best as we can, embody those so that the consequence and influence we do have on the world is one that brings forth greater harmony and evolution through ourselves and into our communities. Because you're wielding an eminent force when you speak at every moment. And you cannot get away from this. And that is why the reminder of responsibility closes out this book. Because to speak without compassion, to speak without attention or intention, is to close one's eyes and just sort of spray out effect. Maybe it's a good thing that happens. Maybe it's a bad thing that happens, but you're necessarily and always responsible for the consequences of your actions. And to deeply familiarize yourself with the potency of language, your speech, is to become aware of that influence and the responsibility that it demands.
I love that, man. And that's a wonderful way to close out a book that is so powerful as well. The onus of evolution. I love that. Like, whoa, whether you like it or not, we are evolving, and the world is evolving through us right now, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. And why not accelerate that process? Why not add to it?
I love that. Where do you, this is again a little bit off topic here, but we are going to wrap up within the next 8 minutes. I tend to wrap them up on the hour. Where do you think we're going? Where do you think that humanity is going? I've often seen a very, very positive outcome. And I think that if we even compared the social and energetic landscape to, let's say, 20 years ago, I think we're doing quite well. It doesn't look like that, but that's what that dissonance, that positive dissonance, is what we're seeing, I think, right now. A lot of the times when we say, hey, you can't abuse power over there, and you can't speak to people like that, and you can't hurt people over here, that's fucking awesome, because back in the day people just did that all the time without any course correction. So where do you see humanity heading right now? I'm curious.
I see us heading towards a point of decision, and it's not necessarily a collective point of decision, but one where the awakening to personal power is made front and center. We can have visions of a beautiful world, and we can have visions of doomsday and all these other things that we might see on the television, but ultimately, my vision is only ever limited to my own life. And I find that through earnest application and dedicated action, I'm able to bring forth a greater good into the world. And so I believe that my life and those affected by it, I pray, will come into greater harmony and greater good. And I believe that all those who are willing to listen to themselves and to become more attuned to their values and virtues and take on the responsibility of acting in alignment with those will necessarily bring forth that same level of goodness. So it all comes down to choice.
I love that, man. And yeah, it is true that if a lot of people all do that at once, it would create quite a resonance field.
It's huge, man. Like, we're already in the resonance field. It's all a question of alignment. And the shared vision is a beautiful thing when we can come into community and speak forth visions that are then seeded in the minds of those community members that become action, regular action and habits. The capacity to transform a landscape, both a social landscape or a literal landscape, is, I think, beyond what a lot of people can fathom nowadays. Raised in apartments and connected to technology so frequently, our ability to course correct, to use your terminology, is already here. It's not something that we're missing. It only takes social harmony and personal harmony to make happen, I believe.
I love that, man. Yeah. Well, again, yeah, it's an interesting time because there is so much change, so much movement. Again, if you compare the collective Meu to 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, definitely, but even 10 years ago, things have changed a lot. And I'm very curious to know. And interestingly enough, technology has very much amplified and quickened this process. And yet technology also might be something that keeps us stuck within the boundaries of a story. And so I think that's another interesting, unique thing that we're working with right now that we can't look back into our collective history to model after. It has to be something new. We've got this thing that connects us all, and like the greatest desires, let's say, of any spiritualist is to have a telepathic connection and to be able to, it's like that is all here right now in the most visceral, like in your face possible way. We are teleprompting each other the way that we would want to send telepathic visions in the past, and I'm still on a fence as to, a lot of people say that the technology is taking away from that. I wonder if it might also be a reflection of us doing that more and more and more, to the point where now it's a physical attribute that we can find through technology. But it is a very unique time in that regard, where things are quickened and ideas can spread fast, like fast. Like, one of the coolest ones, I think personally, is the notion of consent, sexual consent, really just like tore through that Me Too movement, really tore through in 2 years, and it just changed the way that everybody interacts. I think that's fucking cool. Like, that is a unique and interesting thing that I've never really seen before, a social movement happening so fast and taking so quickly like that. So I'm hoping that in the future there'll be even all kinds of different versions of that. And it's a very interesting time. I'm not sure what else to say about it, man. I'm a little bit jumbled in my speech today, ironically, as we're speaking about speech. But I really, really value the interesting expediency of what we're experiencing here in this world. And I really value you, Oak. Thank you so much for coming on today. And thank you so much for describing these beautiful principles in your book. And, it's very inspiring to me as a person who's in the middle of creating something similar. Even just seeing just how articulate and how beautiful everything you're doing has just been absolutely wonderful. Bianca came up to say thank you so much for the insightful conversation. There are many jewels in here to come back to. So thank you for that. And I know that you had mentioned, and I appreciated the clarity of your contract. Can I use some of this stuff for whatever you do going forward? You absolutely can, man. I really appreciate that you have done what you've done, and I appreciate you asking for consent so clearly as well. And Sasha came up to say thank you, Oak, and thank you, Josh. Thank you so much, Sasha, for being in the background, telepathically and physically typing out things so that will shape the conversation that we had today as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate the time and the invitation, the opportunity to share what feels deeply resonant to my heart. And I hope that you and all who hear this find a deep level of value in it. So thank you.
Very much have. Thank you so much, man. We're going to close out now, but just stick around for a second.
Sounds good.